Hello everyone. So today we are going to look into creative writing unit 3.1, 3.2 and 3.3 as we have been talking about the different techniques and different forms of creative writing, how to practice it. I'm sure all of you have been practicing at your homes, you are writing and you have learned something from all the skills that we have been talking for so many days. So today we'll go into a little bit of advanced writing of creative writing. We are going to look into the introduction, irony and tone, the denotation and connotation, the literal and figurative meanings and poetic devices, rhyme, meter, symbolism, archetypes, free verse, blank verse, sound, meaning, types of poetry and verse. So we're going to look into poetry, about the different features of poetry. Now, as you know that poetry is something to do with emotion, so we were talking about the history of poetry. So early poems started off in the Eurasian continent, evolved from folk songs such as Chinese songs, from a neater retell of oral epics such as Sanskrit verses, the Zoroastrian Gathas, and Homeric epics. The Iliad, the Odyssey, as you know by Homer, are the absolute example of the best of the poetry, epic poetry that exists. They talk about the sagas of important heroes, about mythical figures, and ancient Greek attempts to define poetry as Aristotle's poetics focuses on the use of speech and rhetoric, drama, song, and comedy. Later attempts concentrated on features such as repetition, verse form, and rhyme, and emphasized the aesthetics which distinguish poetry from more objectively informative prosaic writing. Poetry uses forms and conventions to suggest differential interpretations of work or to evoke emotive responses. Now, devices such as assonance, alliteration, onomatopoeia, rhythm may convey musical and incantatory effects. The use of ambiguity, symbolism, irony, and other stylistic elements of poetic diction often leaves a poem open to multiple interpretations. Similarly, figures of speech such as metaphor, simile, and metonymy establish a resonance between otherwise disparate images, a layering of meaning, forming connections previously not perceived. Kindred form of resonance may exist between individual verses in their patterns of rhyme and rhythm. So some poetry types are unique to particular cultures and genres and respond to characteristic of language in which poet writes. Now, readers accustomed to identify poetry with Dante, Goethe, or Mackenzie or Rumi may think that it is just as written of lines based on rhyme and regular meter. There are, however, traditions such as biblical poetry that use other means to create rhythm and euphony. Such modern poetry reflects a critic of poetic tradition, testing the principle of euphony itself or altogether foregoing rhyme or set rhythm. In an increasingly globalized world, poets often adopt forms, styles, and techniques from diverse cultures and languages. Poets have contributed to the evolution of the linguistic, expressive, and utilitarian qualities of the language. Now, we'll be discussing the common features of poetry. What are the common features? No matter whichever poetry you are writing, be it epic, sonnet, or say elegy, there are different common features of a poetry. Now, if it looks like a poem, and reads like a poem, then chances are pretty good that it is indeed a poem. Poetry comes in line, and some of which are full sentences, many of which are not. Also, usually these lines don't run out of the margins consistently like a novel. All this gives poetry a distinctive and recognizable look on the page. It often has some underlying form holding things together. While this isn't always true, a lot of poetry conforms to a prescribed structure such as a sonnet, a haiku, etc. Now, it uses imagery. If the poet is worth his or her salt, they will endeavor to create images in the reader's mind using lots of sensory details and figurative language. It has a certain musicality. We could be forgiven for thinking that poetry's natural incarnation is the written word and is habited the page, but the printed word is not where poetry's origins lie. The earliest poems were composed orally and committed to memory, and we can still see the importance the sound of language plays when we read a poem out loud. We can see it too in the attention paid to musical devices that are incorporated into the poem. Deviations such as alliteration, assonance, and rhyme, for example. We will look at many different articles about this in the in the later versions when we talk about poetry. Now let us discuss the purpose of poetry. What is poetry for? Of all the forms the professional writers can take it is the professional poet who often finds himself struggling to make ends meet financially. Poetry can be difficult to understand and it requires a lot of effort on the part of the reader. Students can be forgiven for wondering what exactly is the point of his difficult to write and difficult to read genre that is apparently used to torture the less literary minded during their school years. It may be hard sell to some of our more reluctant students, but there is a point behind all this word symmetry. Poetry's purpose is essentially to help us understand the world around us. It has endeavored to show us things anew that may have previously taken for granted. It offers us new perspective on the familiar. Poetry's purpose is to enable us to see the world with fresh eyes again, like those of a child. In doing this, it also helps us understand our world in a deeper way. Now talking about the structure of poetry, the stanza, though some modern forms of poetry eschew traditional poetic conventions such as rhyme schemes and meter, etc., the stanza still plays an important role in the overall look of printed poetry. But what exactly is a stanza? You may well ask. Now, stanzas are basically the poetic equivalent of a prose paragraph. They are a series of lines that are grouped together, separated from other groups of lines and stanzas by a skip line. Stanzas also come in a variety of lengths dependent either on the whims of the poet or the conventions of a poetic form. There is a variety of technical vocabulary often used to refer to stanzas of specific length. Now, there are different common types of stanzas, such as 2 lines are called a couplet, 3 lines called a tertiet, 4 lines are called a quatrain, 5 lines are a cinquain, 6 lines are sestus, 7 lines are septet, and 8 lines an octave. Let us talk about the types of poetry and their characteristics. There are different types of poetry, some of which we lyric poetry. Lyric poetry concerns is largely with the emotional life of the poet, that is, it's written in his voice and expresses strong thoughts and emotions. There's only one voice in a lyric poem, and we see the world from that single perspective. Most modern poetry is lyric poetry, and that it is personal and introspective. Then comes the narrative poetry. As its name implies, narrative poetry is concerned with storytelling. Just as in a prose story, a narrative poem is most likely to follow the conventions of plot, including elements such as conflict, rising action, climax, resolution, etc. Again, as in the prose stories, narrative poems will most likely be peopled with characters to perform the actions of the tale. Descriptive poetry usually employs a lot of rich emotions, rich imagery to describe the world around the poet. When it most often has a single poetic voice and a strong emotional content, descriptive poetry differs from lyric poetry in that its focus is more of the externalities of the world rather than the interior life of the poet. We have mentioned that poetry often hangs on the conventions of specific underlying structure. Let us now take a look at some of the most common of these subtypes and its defining characteristics. The subtypes of poetry would be sonnets. Sonnets are predominantly concerned with the matters of the heart. If you see a sonnet's recognizably blocky form on a page, there's a good chance the theme will be love. There are two common forms of sonnets, Shakespearean and Petrarchan. They differ slightly in their internal structure, but then both of them have similar line structure. Both of them are written in 8 to 14 lines. Petrarchan comprises of 2 stanzas. First 8 lines pose a question, second line answers the question. The rhyme scheme would be A B B A B B A C D E C D. When it comes to Shakespearean sonnet, it comprises of 3 quatrains of 4 lines each, ends with a rhyming couplet which forms a conclusion. Rhyme scheme is A B A B A B C D C D E F E F and G G. Now we'll talk about a very very complicated but yet very simple poetry, that is haiku. Haiku is a disciplined form of poetry which has its origin in the 17th century Japanese poetry. Usually it is concerned with nature and the natural phenomena such as seasons, weather, etc. They are often quite meditative in tone. There are no real rules regarding themes. The only real demands here relates to structure, and they are written in 3-line stanzas. First line contains 5 syllables, second line contains 7 syllables, and third line contains 5 syllables. Now, due to the short length and limited requirement, there are usually a lot of fun for students to write. They can serve as a great introduction for students to attempt to write poetry according to specific technical requirements of a form. Elegies are a type of poem that usually don't come with specific structural requirements but still constitute a recognizable form of poetry. What makes an elegy? An elegy is a subject, that is death. Elegies are part of lamentation. The word elegy comes from the Greek word elegia. Like this, we have different types of poetry, like the epic, which are long narrative poem, the ode that traces origin to the ancient poet, ballads, which are type of the narrative poetry. So now we shall be looking into the next part of the poetry, that is the rhyme and the meter in traditional poetry. What do we understand by rhyme and meter? So now coming to rhyme and meter. Trochees and iams and dactyls and meter and lines. Now these are strange terms what have to do with the reading and enjoying traditional poetry, but of course poetry who write in free verse poets who write in free verse usually use the traditional poetic building blocks, also write beautiful poetry, although the structure of each of the free verse is different. When poets write in free verse, they devise many different means of creating rhythm and sounds of their poems without recourse to any of the traditional structures. So talking about how to name the meter of a poetry, there are different poetry names depending on the meters, like foot monometer, feet diameter, feet trimeter, feet tetrameter, and so on. So we have all these types, like the feet hexameter. To give a name and all, we do have the different parts and the different type. To give a name to the meter, we add the foot. Now talking about the ballad meters, different types of poems are not just defined by the meter but also by the rhyme scheme. A rhyme scheme is simply that pattern of lines which each stanza is supposed to rhyme with each other. Now for instance, a poem written in regular meter is common to see written in a series of quatrains that have been written A B C D C D. Some common defined types of poets consist of 14 meters is iambic, pentameter, Petrarch or Italian sonnets write in this way. Blank verse consists of iambic pentameter with no rhymes. It's usually long epics or dramas and so on. Now talking about the different types of meter, symbol is normally a term that is used to name a picture, maybe familiar in daily life. Archetypes are original models after which similar things are patterned. Now there are three basic types of archetypes: the quest, the motive used for a search for someone; the task, to save the kingdom or to win the fair lady; initiation is the archetype, usually the form of initiation into adult life; the journey sends the hero into search for some truth; the fall describes a descent from higher to a lower state of being; the death and rebirth, the most common of all situations and archetypes; nature versus mechanistic world; battle between good and evil, obviously the battle between two primal forces; mankind shows eternal optimism; the unhealable wound. This wound is either physical or psychological and cannot be healed fully; the ritual, the actual ceremonies, the initiate experience that will mark the rite of passage; the magic weapon symbolizes the extraordinary quality of the hero. Now talking of character archetypes, the hero is obviously the protagonist; the father-son conflict is a separation during childhood; the young man to province, the hero is printed as a young man and raised by strangers, and so on. Now we will be moving to the next part of our discussion, that has to do with the musicality of poetry, the blank verse, the free verse, and so on. So let us discuss about blank verse and free verse. Blank verse and free verse are the most two important features of poetry. Blank verse refers to a poetry written in regular metrical but unrhymed lines. Free verse refers to an open form of poetry that has no rhyme or rhythm. The main difference between blank verse and free verse is that free verse is not written in consistent meter, rhyme, or any other musical pattern, whereas blank verse is written in regular metrical pattern. Now blank verse in poetry is mostly written in iambic pentameter. Blank verse is also known as unrhymed iambic pentameter. It is a type of verse contains a consistent meter of 10 syllables in each line. The unstressed syllables are followed by stressed ones, therefore it contains 5 stressed syllables. Blank verse is also said to be one of the most common and influential form of English poetry. Many of the English poems have been written in this style. Henry Howard of Surrey is considered to be the first poet to use blank verse in English literature. Now blank verse is also used by many prominent writers like John Milton, William Shakespeare, Christopher Marlowe, John Donne, John Keats, and so on. Now, talking about free verse, is a form of poetry that does not use a consistent meter, rhyme, or any other pattern. Although it is devoid of regular rhyme or meter, it still provides artistic expression. It tends to follow the rhythm of natural speech. Since it does not follow set rule, the poet can give any shape to that poem. Free verse also gives a greater freedom for poets to choose words without bothering about the rhyme and rhythm. It is commonly used in contemporary poetry. Free verse can be observed in poets like Emily Dickinson, Walt Whitman, Ezra Pound, John Ashbery. Now, this was all about the different types of poetry and the poetic form. I hope you all have enjoyed. I am sure that many of you who may not have attempted to write a poetry is going to write a poetry now. You will be at least knowing the different types, the patterns, the different meters that you have to use. But then keep one thing in mind: everything comes with practice. So the more you practice, the better you write a poetry. Start writing a poetry, or start deciphering the different types of poetries that are there. The poetries that you may have read previously, you may not remember now, but then it will be easier for you if you have a better idea about poetry. When before you start writing any kind of poetry, it always helps in one way or the other. Now, you may try attempting to write an ode or a ballad, although is a very older form of poetry, but it's a narrative poetry. It can be easily adapted as a song lyric. Ballads have tight formal constructions. It tells a story in simple language, so you can try attempting a ballad. You can also try attempting writing a ode, wherein a poetry form that traces origin from the ancient Greece, intended to be a song. Now, the term ode also refers to a type of lyrical poetry that addresses and often praises a certain person, thing, and event. So you can think of writing such kind of poetry. It always helps. It will help you in understanding. It will help you in defining. So you can start somewhere. You can start writing haikus as well. They are very, they are very easy form of writing poetry. So before writing any poetry, try to understand what kind you are born for. So that was all about poetry and its different types, meters, symbols, rhythm. Poetry is simple when it's written from your heart. You should give in a lot of emotions when you are writing poetry. It has to be spontaneous. It's basically a spontaneous flow of emotions in the words of William Wordsworth. So make sure when you're writing poetry, you are letting your emotions out, and then later on you can go back and you can formulate you can think of different using different patterns, and tweaking your language, reforming it, refining it in a different way. So that will be all from my side. Thank you.